As we move through these uncertain times, now, more than ever, it's vitally important that we educate ourselves about the effect that stress can have on our health in order for us to start to combat all of the ways that it shows up in our day-to-day lives. Fear is the number one factor that we must consider when it comes to stress, and we've all been up against the fear factor as we've faced the many challenges that COVID has brought us over the last year or so. Now, each person's response to fear is totally unique to them, and this is dependent upon how their brain has been hardwired to react to fearful situations. In fact, almost all of our fears are due to social conditioning and the experiences that we each have as we move through our own journey in life. Did you know that we're actually born with just two fears, those being the fear of loud noises and the fear of falling? Everything else that we react to as perceived fear or danger is due to our own personal limitations that we create within the mind and how we've learned to respond to those limitations. Many of us can develop deep-rooted fears throughout our lifetime, such as phobias of spiders or flying, for example. And whilst these fears may feel paralysing at times to those who suffer from them, they can seem completely irrational to those who don't. Now, a lot of these fears or phobias are created because of how our brain develops as children. As we are unable to rationalise our experiences for the first 7 to 10 years of our lives, this can leave us with irrational or unconscious fears. Now, our physical senses trigger these fears, and this is why certain places, smells, or music, for example, can bring up distant memories from our past, which sometimes we may not even be consciously aware of. Now, if you have a fear of heights, for example, simply watching a movie where the character is looking over a ledge or about to fall from the tall building can often be enough to trigger a fearful reaction. And in fact, any kind of interaction with our screens can be extremely powerful, not just in triggering existing memories, but being the root cause of the fear or phobia itself, with horror movies being a prime example. Now, the reason that fearful experiences or limiting beliefs can create stress in our bodies is due to the way that we have evolved over the ages and an ancient part of our brain that developed in order to protect us from danger, which is now ironically the thing that is slowly killing us. The amygdala, or the reptilian brain as it's often also called, is designed to protect us from danger, and it is programmed by our experiences in life. Now, many years ago, a dangerous situation may have been a wild animal or another hunter, so our bodies evolved to cope with this by triggering a chemical reaction called the fight or flight response. This releases chemicals into our bloodstream which provide an extra burst of energy, enabling us to run to safety. So fast forward a few thousand years, and whilst we are no longer faced with such life-threatening situations, our bodies are still genetically programmed to respond in the exact same way. And as the amygdala is instinctive, the fight or flight response has often already kicked in before we have any time to rationalise the situation that we're in. The reaction triggered by the fight or flight response releases chemicals into our bloodstream such as cortisol and adrenaline. And these are great if you're directing them into high energy activities. But if you lead a relatively sedentary lifestyle, as a growing number of us do these days, then all of this unwanted body chemistry loiters in your bloodstream and creates a toxic, acidic environment. The side effects that this causes includes anxiety, inflammation, high blood pressure, increased heart rate and palpitations, all of which are highly stressful for the body to cope with. In fact, these chemicals are so dangerous in high quantities that our body literally shuts down all non-essential processes to get to work in removing them and bringing you back into balance. Now, the more trauma a person experiences in childhood, the more their brain will become hardwired to respond to every situation as potentially dangerous. This can leave them feeling constantly on the defensive, in fear of being attacked in some way. And when we experience trauma in our early childhood, we can turn to things such as TV or junk food for comfort when we're feeling afraid. And it's the lack of rational judgment that we have in our earliest years that can often lead to us placing value in these things, even though they have a very unhealthy impact on our lives and fail to create any true value. Adverse childhood experiences have been researched widely over the last few decades, and if you have suffered from any of the following during your childhood, then there is a significant chance that your reaction to fear will be compounded. In fact, research has shown that if you have experienced 6 or more of these ACEs, that the lifestyle choices and dangerous situations that you put yourself in as a teenager and young adult can lead to your lifespan being reduced by up to 20 years. Now, the more exposure that a child has to fearful situations, the more that their developing mind will hardwire their responses towards fear. This can affect attention and memory, in addition to executive functioning skills such as organisation, planning, and self-regulation. Now, as the amygdala is programmed by our experiences of fear, If we grow up in an environment where fear was present on a regular basis, the neural pathways in our brain can become so strong that a person ends up being constantly on high alert. This triggers an elevated stress response level, causes them to have extreme reactions to anything that they perceive as dangerous, and this can often manifest as aggressive and defensive behaviour. And in fact, there is now evidence to show that where there has been significant trauma in a child's life, they could have been mistakenly diagnosed as having attention deficit disorder, when it may actually be a result of the way the child's brain has developed to cope with fear. Now, when it comes to the way that people cope with fear, the spectrum can be wide and varied. For a person who has suffered trauma, they can often project their inner turmoil, and we see this playing out over and over again on social media with the heated debates and trolling. This can often be a result of people who have a deep core wound, and because they've never been taught how to cope with the internal trauma they've experienced, they end up projecting their pain onto others as a form of pain management. But of course, not all pain management is outwardly projected, and many people will internalise their pain and deal with it in ways that don't directly impact others. Two of the most common forms of internalised pain management that we create when we aren't taught how to effectively manage emotion as a child are comfort eating and entertainment. Now, as most of the food that we eat now contains sugar and other addictive substances, this can get us hooked on them, and we can end up with a real lack of nutrition in the food that we eat, which also feeds into the obesity epidemic and other food-related illnesses such as diabetes and heart disease. Couple this with binge watching, and that we are then also bombarded with advertising and product placement, which further triggers our desire for food and drink. This only exacerbates the problem, making our choices seem like normal behaviour when in actual fact they are making us sick. And that's without mentioning the inevitable emotional rollercoaster that we will face after overindulging. This can create a cycle of toxic emotions ranging from anger at yourself for giving in to temptation to guilt and shame for being gluttonous. And these kind of unhealthy coping mechanisms are feeding into the vicious cycle that is created when we don't learn how to effectively manage stress in our lives. A huge influence in this cycle is the decision fatigue that we can all suffer from. Now, our brain is like a battery, and it needs to be recharged every day, which happens when we sleep. For every decision that we make, it uses a little bit of this brain battery. The more decisions that we have to make each and every day, the more we run the risk of decision fatigue, which is one of the biggest causes of daily stress in our lives. Now, as our internal battery life drains, so does our willpower, which is often why we make our worst decisions later on in the evening, and many of these poor choices are often food and drink related. But it's not just our reaction to fear that elevates cortisol. What we eat and drink can also disrupt this balance. Too much acidic food spikes our cortisol levels in the bloodstream, creating a toxic environment which causes the body to shut down the daily maintenance work that it carries out to keep us fit and healthy. Now, the way in which your body combats this acidity is by sending the most alkaline substance it has straight to your vital organs such as your heart and your gut in order to protect them. And this substance just happens to be fat. Yes, stress can be a determining factor in any kind of weight loss you want to embark upon, and it can also be the reason why it's often so difficult to shift excess weight around your stomach. This interruption of your body's daily maintenance routine puts your natural cycles out of balance, and as well as impacting your body's ability to recharge and rejuvenate as you sleep, you wake up on less than 100% battery and begin again the following day with the same cycle of behaviour. Over time, just like your mobile phone, you stop functioning as fast and efficiently as you used to, and eventually something gives and breaks down. So it's important that we get real about the long-term impact that stress is having on our bodies. And to do this, we need to highlight why it's essential to develop healthy coping strategies, as stress is an inevitable part of our lives. So, our reaction to fear creates stress, which spikes our cortisol levels. When this is consistently elevated, it impacts our mitochondrial health. Mitochondria are the cells in our body which are responsible for our energy production, and great energy equals great health. So, long-term damage to these vital cells will severely impact your quality of life. Now, the impact that stress has on our health is multifaceted, but as with everything, it all begins in the mind. Stress begins as a reaction to anything that we perceive as dangerous, and the biochemical reaction it creates interrupts our body's repair system, which weakens our immune system. Persistent fearful thinking can seriously affect your state of mind, which is contributing to the rise in mental disorders such as anxiety and depression. Now, the biochemical reaction that stress creates leads to inflammation in your body, which is the root cause of almost all illness and disease. And over time, this will start to impact your health and can cause digestive issues such as irritable bowel syndrome and ulcers. Stress and worry will also accelerate ageing and can increase the number of fine lines and wrinkles, as well as the general aches and pains that usually go hand in hand with older age. And in worst case scenarios, if stress isn't effectively managed, it can progress to diseases such as cardiovascular damage. And over time, if you're constantly living in fear, the toxic cocktail that this will create within our body's biochemistry can lead to premature death. Now, this of course doesn't happen overnight, but now more than ever we must be mindful as to how we react to stress and fear, as it can severely implicate our body's ability in fighting off disease and illness. So we need to face facts. We live in a world that is constantly bombarding us with information, advertising, and things to feel stressed or anxious about. Our fears are the root cause of all stress, and the collective fear that most humans have is death. COVID has fed into this fear on a global level, and now you understand how stress impacts our health. Hopefully, you can make the connection as to why COVID has taken so many lives. The global news focus that COVID created caused huge amounts of unnecessary stress in our lives, causing us to worry about the future. This weakened our immune systems, making it more difficult to fight off the virus if we came into contact with it. Now, many people have self-medicated during lockdown with alcohol. But alcohol is a depressant, and it also increases our cortisol levels, as well as creating an imbalance with other biochemistry in our bodies, which further impacts our health and well-being. And alcohol isn't alone when it comes to raising our stress levels, and cortisol will also spike from our intake of sugar, which is pretty much in all processed foods nowadays. And caffeine should be an obvious one here. This powerful psychoactive drug induces a cortisol kick from our morning brew that many of us have come to rely on. But also, trans and animal fats in our foods can also increase the potential deadly chemical cortisol in our bloodstream, and this too is causing unnecessary stress on our major organs. So we've reached a crossroad in our evolution, one in which we must make a choice. Do we continue to allow our reptilian brain to dominate our lives and limit our health, or do we choose another way, one in which we start to reprogram the way that we think, feel and act, so that we can uplevel our health and well-being and start to live a more happy and fulfilled life? Now, all stress is a response, and this begins in our mind with how we are programmed to react to fear. To override these responses, we must begin to create new neural pathways that will counteract the way that we currently react to stress and fear. Unfortunately, because of our obsession with the quick fix, we expect there to be an instant solution, but there just isn't. This programming developed over many years, and we will need to accept that it will take time and effort to make the healthy changes required. And the only way to do this is by putting in the work each and every day to reprogram the way that we think, feel and act. It might seem like a lot of change is needed, but it doesn't need to happen all at once. Just small, consistent steps taken every day. Now, in our session on change, we'll be taking a look at how to approach this change, and I'll be sharing with you what we need to focus on in order for change to be effective, but also what we need to stop focusing on in order to support this shift. But now we've come to the time where I want you to take out your journals in order to make everything that we've covered in this session meaningful to your own life. So I want to start by asking you, what are you most afraid of? Do you have any specific fears or phobias that trigger a stressful response in you? And did you experience trauma as a child? And if so, did you recognise any of the adverse childhood experiences we covered in the section on trauma as being something that you yourself went through? Now, when it comes to coping mechanisms, how do you currently cope with stress? Are there any ways in which you're self-medicating with food, TV, alcohol, or even drugs, for example? And are these coping strategies limiting your life in any way? And when it comes to the pandemic, how has COVID and the fear that is created impacted your own stress levels? Are you able to see any long-term implications that this may have created for your health? Now, today's session may have been quite heavy going for some people, so if you feel the need to share any uncomfortable feelings that have come up for you throughout this video or during the accompanying exercise, then it may help to speak about it in the group. Or any other questions that you may have, feel free to direct message me on either Facebook or Instagram.